On Business Incorporated today, South Africa's fuel price set to fall in 2023. And Egypt to launch new international tender to explore gas and oil in the Mediterranean and the Nile Delta. In Ivory Coast, cocoa grind rises up 6.9% year-on-year in November. Hello and welcome to Business Incorporated. I'm Will Ebong. First things first, let's check in on the market, starting with Africa. Most of major equities are still closed for the Christmas holiday. However, but the exchange in Egypt is up. At intraday, it was trading at 0.35%, so closing at 14,000 points there. But in the Middle East, we see sentiments are mixed. At intraday, the Abu Dhabi index is up 0.47%, 0.45. The Abu Dhabi index is down 0.06%. Dubai's index is up 0.45%. While in Saudi Arabia and Qatari indexes, they were up 0.98 and down 0.19%. We move over to other matters in Europe, where in a matter of days, the tiny European nation of Croatia will usher in two very big changes, swapping its currency out for the euro and joining Europe's visa-free Schengen travel agreement. Deutsche Welle's Steve Beasley joins us from Berlin for more. Steven, how important are these changes for Croatia?
Croatia actually joined the European Union almost 10 years ago in July 2013, and it's safe to say that what's going to happen on January 1st is one of the biggest changes to the country since then. And in a way, that accession to the EU is going to be made visible in a way that it hasn't to households and to businesses. People are going to have new money in their pockets. It's going to look different. It's going to exchange differently at first. And they're also going to have an added dimension to their passport in that they can freely travel across this Eurozone. Croatia is a relatively small country of only 4 million people. It's also only the second former member of Yugoslavia, or member of the former Yugoslavia, I should say, to join the EU after Slovenia. The benefits of a common currency for a country like this are that essentially it smooths up travel and the ability to exchange money for businesses, for households. And it makes it easier to do business across the greater Eurozone and the greater EU. And that's huge for a small country. It's also helpful for tourists, and tourism is the biggest sector for Croatia, so that's not a small thing at all. And in general, of course, going into a larger monetary union, there's more stability. There's a much more stable currency that trades at a much more stable rate against some of the world's largest currencies. So that is a benefit for Croatia. Now, across the country, shops and banks are already getting ready for this transition. The banks have already received the monetary notes. They've received coins. There will be a 14-day transition period after January 1st, beginning January 1st, in which both the current currency, the kuna, and the euro can be used to purchase items, after which customers will receive their change in euros. So this is a transition that will take place in a matter of weeks, and then Croatia will have more euros in its pocket.
I don't know, Steven. Talk to me about this. The euro has weakened in the past year. We've seen visa-free travel has also come under pressure. Are the classic benefits of the EU still alluring?
Yeah, the euro, like many other currencies, has weakened against the dollar. It's regained some of those losses in recent weeks as the outlook here has improved. Really, that has been based on the dim global economic outlook of recent months. The dollar is a safe haven. More investment floods into it and strengthens the dollar against other currencies as investors fear what they're seeing worldwide. There's also the fact that in the U.S., monetary policy has tightened at a much faster rate than here in Europe. We've seen interest rate hikes there taking place much much more often and much faster. They tend to be also much higher. The ECB has caught up in the meantime somewhat. They've started raising rates as well, and that's helped a little bit. I think for a country like Croatia, of course, the biggest handover of sovereignty when it comes to what they're doing with the EU is when they joined it almost 10 years ago. Frankly, that's really the biggest change that has happened, because they agreed to regulations that apply in the EU. They also agreed to strict budgeting rules that prohibits certain levels of deficits, for example. So some of the biggest sort of gives already have come up. In terms of the currency, there is, of course, something that happens there as well. There is a loss of sovereignty. When you have your own currency, you can, of course, control it. You can weaken it when you want. You can strengthen it when you want, by virtue of your own central bank. Now those decisions will be made in Frankfurt through the European Central Bank. Now, Croatia, of course, has a seat at that table, but it's not alone. So that is part of the European project. The European Union is a loss of sovereignty for individual nations to gain, ideally, something bigger. And when you're a small country like Croatia, this is probably more to your benefit. The same goes for when you look at borders. Yes, there has been more challenges to borders recently. When you look at the COVID pandemic, there were borders came back again amongst some countries as they worried about transmission of the disease. Also with the migration waves that came before that, some of the bigger ones, there have been efforts to re-erect borders. For the most part, though, freedom of movement has been guaranteed. And again, it's more beneficial for more countries than it is not. And especially when you look at a smaller country like Croatia, which is going to benefit from being connected even more closely to larger economies.
So we'll keep tracking that. But what can we expect from the European markets today?
Well, we're seeing positive gains out of the gate from European markets. The DAX up 0.8% to begin with. The CAC 40 also up. Euro stocks up as well. And mostly they're responding to the good news out of Asia, and that is that China is further loosening its COVID restrictions. In this case, it is doing away with the quarantine requirements for those traveling into the country. That means that more Chinese people are going to be traveling outside of the country for whatever reason, also on business trips. And that means also that business people in Europe and elsewhere in the world are going to be able to have a much easier time traveling to China. And so there are many benefits that are seen through this. Businesses are responding, or I should say investors are responding accordingly. But we should also mention that trading volumes are going to be low this week. Many of them are already set because investors may be going on vacation. So we're not likely to see too much craziness this week, and especially as there's not going to be a whole lot of new data releases outside of some U.S. job numbers later this week.
Thanks a lot, Stephen, for always giving us the updates. Now to the UK, where activities are picking up after the Christmas holiday, but largely marred by various strike actions. Juliana is right there in London with more developments and details on this. So, Juliana, how much of the Christmas holiday was disrupted by the strikes?
Good afternoon, Will. It was severely disrupted, and the disruption continues, sadly, for millions of Brits as another round, I believe it's the third round of a series of 6 rounds of rail strikes that are going to be impacting commuters up and down the country. And already before the Christmas period, there was very little festive cheer in the air, and that's because of the cost of living crisis. We know that inflation is at a 40-year high. It's really difficult for people to heat their homes and put food on the tables at the moment anyway. So I think people were planning for a very nice Christmas where they'd be able to, celebrate with colleagues for drinks after work, go and travel across the country to see their family. And they've not been able to do that because there has been so much disruption. And this is going to be a huge headache for Prime Minister Rishi Sunak when the House of Commons reconvene after this new year, because some economists say that, it was a huge gamble for him and the cabinet not to sit down with union bosses, not to give in to their pay demands, because it is going to have a long-term impact on the British economy, which is already in a recession, according to the Bank of England governor, Andrew Bailey. So it hasn't been that great, and it doesn't appear as if things are going to change anytime soon. As I said, we are already again in another rail strike, which is why it's so difficult for people to come down and shop in Oxford Street. Yes, we did have data showing that retail sales picked up yesterday, but if you compare that to last year, we had Omicron, so it's not really a good comparison. We need to see how much was taken behind the tills. But yes, it is a very doom and gloom in this country at the moment, and fingers crossed it picks up in the new year.
Painting a picture of a very gloomy Christmas there, Juliana. We hope that, as you said, that it will pick up in the new year. But also, how are households managing to reduce energy use this holiday?
Well, that's another good question. That's another political point that is gripping the nation at the moment. Energy costs, pretty severe across the world, but particularly acute in Britain because it is so cold. And this is the time when people want to put their heating on. Today, led by the Energy Secretary, Grant Shapps, any of our viewers watching from the UK will start to notice this 30-second, £18 million advertorial campaign, basically advising households how they can cut back on their consumer spending. This was first put together in the summer, but the then Prime Minister Liz Truss was dead against it because Britain doesn't like to be controlled. Anytime the government tell people what to do, particularly when it comes to using common sense, it's described as being a nanny state. But because bills are so high, people are on the brink. The government have decided to roll this out, just advising people, yes, how they can save costs. And it is very important. We do have the energy price guarantee at £2,500 in a year. That is not going to last beyond April. What happens after that? And the £2,500 is only for households. Businesses are still on the brink. We had data released a couple of weeks ago showing that insolvencies are on the rise. And so, yes, it is really difficult at the moment. Hopefully, again, we do have this advert coming out today, so maybe people can save a few pennies, but I think it's more than a few pennies that people need to save to get back to where they were pre-pandemic.
Juliana, people are already having a gloomy Christmas. Families do have to stay warm. We'll just see how this program, pans out in the UK and hope families can actually stay warm in this Christmas and the holiday period. But just moving on, how are markets looking after the holiday?
Well, markets are okay. It's actually a bank holiday, which is why I'm just outside of the studio, but outside, because everything is closed in the UK at the moment. So although the FTSE is open, there is no trading today. So we'll have a look at the last numbers as showing that the FTSE was actually in positive territory, up 0.11%. That's the all-share index. The FTSE 100 up by 0.05%, and the FTSE 250, the domestic market, that too was up by 0.36%. The British pound just shed a couple of points off the US dollar, currently trading down 0.07%. Down to the British pound against the euro by 0.29%, but up against the Japanese yen at 0.29%. We'll have the full live figures tomorrow when the markets and the trading are back up and running well.
Thank you so much, Juliana. It's always good to have you on the program.
Thank you.
Now, stocks in Asia rose as China officially announced overnight it will end quarantine for inbound travelers on January the 8th, symbolizing an end to its zero-COVID policy that held for nearly 3 years. Down, the Shanghai Composite rose 0.98% to close over 3,000 points, while markets in Hong Kong and Australia were closed for Christmas holiday. Now, in Japan, the Nikkei 225 rose 0.16% as the nation saw retail sales up for the 9th consecutive month, led by tourism sector. Now, the Kospi in South Korea, that gained 0.68% to close. Now move over to the U.S., where stock futures rose early on Tuesday as investors head into the final trading days of 2022. And that's deliberating whether a Santa Claus rally will appear and lift a market that has been weighed down by recession fears. The Dow Jones Industrial Average futures rose by 0.67%. S&P 500 and NASDAQ 100 futures advanced 0.72% and 0.65% each. Now, Friday marked the start of the time period for Santa Claus rally, which is typically considered the final 5-day trading stretch in the current year, as well as the first 2 trading days in the new year. The markets were closed Monday for the Christmas holiday. Now, due to low trading volumes, investors are expecting either relative quiet or further volatility during the holiday-shortened week. On the economic front, traders are expecting the latest data on November wholesale inventories and the October S&P Case-Shiller home prices on Tuesday before the bell. We'll go on a quick break. More stories from the African continent in a bit. Do stay with us. This is Business Incorporated. Welcome back. A recent report by the European Investment Bank, International Solar Alliance, and the African Union shows that Africa has the potential to produce 1 trillion euros worth of green hydrogen by 2035. And that's the 1 trillion green hydrogen investment can deliver the equivalent of more than 1/3 of Africa's current energy consumption. It can also boost GDP, improve clean water supply, and empower communities, as well as reduce emissions by 40%. Now, according to the study, Africa can secure access to clean and sustainable energy on the continent and become a global energy player through green hydrogen exports. Now, Chinan Dikwal, hydrogen expert and vice chair of the African Energy Council, AEC, joins us to give us more insights and the possibilities of this in Africa. Good to have you on the program, Chinan.
I will. Great pleasure to be here. Yes, great talking to your listeners.
Now, Chinan, this is the first detailed research of the feasible development of green hydrogen across Africa. Now, what are the requirements to enable the 50 million tons of green hydrogen by 2035?
Thanks, Will. I think that's a great question. So a couple of things before I answer that question. I was going to say exactly that. This is the first sort of continent-wide study that looks to pull together all the strands of work that are happening independently across various parts of the continent. That's the first thing to say. You're 100% right. It's commissioned by the African Union, so at the center of it, the coordinating body, but also, the International Solar Alliance and the European Investment Bank. So just to put that in context, it's a whole consortium of financiers, an organization of African bodies, but also, sort of developers, solid developers coming together. It will require quite a lot of, investment, but also infrastructure to make this happen across Africa. So if you think about where we are today, there are pockets of activity happening sort of in the northwest part of Africa, around Mauritania and Morocco. Very much so. There are other things happening in the south of Africa as well, and some happening in the east around Egypt. Each of those projects, producing green hydrogen, so renewable energy, solar combined with water to produce green hydrogen. Each of those requires a huge amount of investment that runs into billions and billions of dollars, and ultimately becomes an infrastructure question. Do we have the necessary infrastructure to make that happen and produce that hydrogen at the beach in Africa and then consume it in Africa, but also ship it internationally so we can get paid for that export? Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, but this study, when we look at it, it's got a lot of support from African governments. But I'm wondering, why green hydrogen for exports? You just mentioned it, and not Africa's industrialization. Why is it not focused on that?
A great question. So it's both, actually, Will. It's both. First thing is to produce it and consume it here in Africa, generate energy here in Africa and consume it here. And then the second component is then for us to export it out into key demand centers around the world. And there are several around us in Africa. But if I just make this point, for Africa to industrialize, we would have to very rapidly have the energy required to run our industries and everything. Now, that requirement stays even if the energy is crude oil or gas or whatever it is, or hydrogen. That requirement stays. So the first precursor in this study says that once the hydrogen is produced, we'd like to consume it in here. Again, it goes back to that question of the infrastructure required for us to consume that hydrogen. Do we have the necessary pipelines? For hydrogen pipelines, extremely specialty type pipelines. They're not like natural gas pipelines that you just produce with carbon steel. These are extremely specialist type pipelines that are required. Do we have the infrastructure? Do we have the compressors at hand? I suppose the key thing for Africa is for that to happen, you would need a huge amount of investment. Now, going to the export side, that's perhaps a lot clearer. It's much, much clearer, because when you produce hydrogen on the beach and then you turn that hydrogen into a carrier for you to take to Europe, that's I think it's a lot more advanced, if you ask me. It's a lot more advanced, putting hydrogen on a ship and sending away into Europe markets, because those markets already have some infrastructure that can receive that hydrogen. What Africa needs to think about today domestically is the question of, once we produce it, do we have the pipelines to send it, let's say to Abuja or to Lagos? And even when it gets to Lagos, do we have infrastructure there for us to be able to combust that hydrogen or use it in fuel cells? Do we have those at hand to utilize that energy?
Mm. Now, you mentioned some countries, and the study also shows that about 4 spots, African hubs, were selected for this. We have Mauritania, Morocco, Southern Africa, and Egypt, as you mentioned earlier. Why is Nigeria missing in the mix here?
It's a great question, actually. I've asked that question myself, but I think it's slightly clear. So what the study does is it looks at 3 key hubs of development. The first hub, like I was saying, there it's the northwest. So the first hub is northwestern. So it has Mauritania and Morocco in there producing. I think it's something like 300. Well, actually, I think 350 gigawatt capacity of installed solar. Then you have the eastern hub there. That's mainly Egypt. So Egypt producing green hydrogen there with a pipeline. I think about 1,900 going into Greece. If I go back to the one on the northwest, that pipeline I think goes into Spain. Actually, they're looking at the pipeline to Spain. And then on the southern part of Africa, you have South Africa and Namibia using hydrogen for exporting to Japan and other countries. Nigeria is a bit missing from there, and I think it's 2 reasons. One, Nigeria is very gas rich. Okay, so we haven't quite, I think, in the last couple of years, given a lot of attention to green hydrogen. There have been quite a few discussions around blue hydrogen. Okay, so let me just describe that. Green hydrogen is produced from solar energy or wind, renewable sources. Blue hydrogen is produced from natural gas, which Nigeria has an abundance of. So in Nigeria, we have an abundance of natural gas. So there have been discussions of blue hydrogen in Nigeria as opposed to green, which is why you might see that, on this particular study, Nigeria is a bit missing. The other thing, of course, again, is for you to produce green hydrogen, which is what this study is, you need a massive amount of land. A massive amount of land. So if you take the case of Mauritania, about 5% of the total land in Mauritania is going to be used for hydrogen production.
Okay, Chinan.
Nigeria is quite dense in population.
Okay.
So there's also the constraint of land in that regard. So there are several things that meant that Nigeria is missing from there, but we do have the advantage without a doubt when it comes to blue hydrogen. Nigeria can produce blue hydrogen much cheaper, perhaps even than green hydrogen.
Oh, thank you so much, Chinan Dickwal, Vice Chair, African Energy Council, AEC, for joining us today and sharing your perspectives. And probably we'll have more conversation on this some other time.
Pleasure. Thanks, Bob.
And now, South Africa's latest weekly fuel price update from the Central Energy Fund shows that South African motorists can expect a big drop in fuel prices at the start of 2023. According to the CEF's data for the week ending December the 21st, motorists can expect a petrol price cut of around R1.94 per litre in January 2023, while diesel could be cut by as much as R2.73 per litre. The lower prices are being driven by much lower international product prices as well as strength in the rand relative to the US dollar. Now, Egypt has announced plans to launch a fresh international tender to explore for oil and natural gas in 12 blocks in the Mediterranean and the Nile Delta regions. According to the Minister of Petroleum and Mineral Resources, Tarek El Molla, the international tender is set to be launched by the Egyptian Natural Gas Holding Company with the aim of attracting new foreign companies to operate in the country. This is the third tender to be put forward through the Egypt's digital portal for exploration and production that was launched early 2021. Now, Ivory Coast's cocoa grind has risen 6.9% year-on-year in November to over 100,000 tons, and that's according to latest data from the Exporters Association, JPEX. The report shows that total grind from the start of the 2022 and 2023 season in October stood at 55,248 tons of beans by the end of November, up 5.1% compared with 52,580 tons at the same time last season. This increase occurs despite the lack of rain threatening mid-crop harvest in the country, and Ivory Coast is the world's top cocoa producer and is vying with the Netherlands for the spot of leading grinder. And that's it on Business Incorporated. Do join us tomorrow, same time, for another edition of the program. I'm Will Ibong. Thanks for watching.